Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone. In the 1810s, when a young Charles Dickens was only pip-sized, it is quite conceivable that as he stood with his father John on the banks of the Medway looking out across the mass of shipping as it wound its way to the sea, that he would have seen perhaps the HMS Ganymede or the HMS Canada, both naval beasts from the Napoleonic Wars, but which were now fixed and anchored as other lighter vessels drifted past them. John Dickens, with his taste for the theatrical, may well have told frightening tales to his son of the prisoners now housed aboard those imposing ships, and out of their shadows young Charlie may have seen grey figures in rowboats creeping towards the shore. Dr. Anna McKay is a social and cultural historian who specialises in both 18th and 19th century British maritime history and the methods of confinement that were practised throughout that period. Her research has taken her to historic prisoner-of-war depots and penal colonies around the world. She has also undertaken archival research in the UK, Australia, Bermuda, and Canada, and she is currently writing a book on the hulks, and is therefore best placed to tell us how true to life Dickens's portrayal of Magwitch really is. And reading excerpts from Great Expectations and contemporary newspapers is my dear friend from the Bristol theatre scene, Matt Grinter. Anna, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's lovely to talk to you on this. What a fascinating subject. And it's not one that I feel has been very widely talked about. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think, most of us are familiar with that beginning of Great Expectations, this sort of like murky marshes and escaped convicts and prison hulks from that angle. But, seeing the sort of truth behind that history is very interesting.
Yeah, and where did they get the name hulks from then? It's a question Pip asks, but he's never really answered properly.
It's the word for a dismantled ship. So like a warship is what the prison hulks were generally. So they're these sort of decommissioned and dismantled warships. So imagine a warship with all its sails and rigging and masts and everything like that. They're all stripped off and right down to the bare bones of the ship. And, these ships, they couldn't move except for by towing. So they become these sort of immobile boats where they use as floating prisons.
Mrs. Joe, said I as a last resort, I should like to know, if you wouldn't much mind, where the firing comes from. Lord bless the boy, exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but rather the contrary. From the hulks? Oh. And, please, what's hulks? Said I. That's the way with this boy, exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with her needle and thread and shaking her head at me. Answer him one question and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships, right? Cross the mashes. I wonder who's put into prison ships and why they're put there, I said in a general way and with quiet desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joe, who immediately rose. I tell you what, she said, I didn't bring you up by hand to badger people's lives out. People are put into hulks because they murder and because they rob and forge and do all sorts of bad. And they always begin by asking questions. Now, you get along to bed.
So what were the steps then that led you personally towards the hulks? Where did this come in for you?
This was actually a PhD of mine that was in collaboration with the University of Leicester and the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. So it was actually, it was called a collaborative studentship. So what that means is that, you work with a museum to sort of bring to light their collections. So the National Maritime Museum had some really cool sort of, bits and bobs, mainly actually convict-made objects and prisoner-of-war-made objects. Because at the same time as convict hulks being moored in the waters around Britain, you also had prisoner of war ships. So imagine Napoleonic Wars, all these prisoners, people getting captured through warfare. And there are these two different kinds of ships moored in the same dockyards. And, people used to actually go and visit them and row between the convict ships and the prisoner of war ships to like see the prisoners.
Who on earth rowed out to sort of look and gawp at these vessels then?
It was tourists. It was really strange. People used to all members of society. I have one example of during the Napoleonic Wars, this woman called Lady Jerningham. She said she went out with her son and they rowed out. They paid someone to row them out in a rowing boat to look at the prisoners. And French prisoners of war, in particular, used to actually sort of dangle objects to sell down the sides of the ships on strings, and people used to put money up and buy she said we bought a guillotine neatly done in bone. So from their rations, the prisoners, this is convicts and prisoners of war, used to make these items. Convicts, I always find it interesting that convicts were sort of making more useful things. They weren't really selling them to people as much as using them themselves. So the objects that convicts made were things like skeleton keys to help them escape from the hulks. And they'd also make, they said, indecent toys made from bone work that they used to sell to dockyard labourers. So they had a bit of a roaring trade going on in the background there.
That's amazing, right? And presumably prisoners of war held probably a higher status than convicts then, maybe not very much, or were they despised in the same way?
They were despised in different ways. So the convicts are seen, in this early period, so Napoleonic Wars, turn of the 19th century, prisoners of war are seen as like the enemy. We're at war against France. Even if you were a Spanish prisoner of war, if you were caught up in warfare and captured, you would be seen as French, and you'd be like, everyone in society would think that you were, corrupting and anti establishment and monarchy. So you have that with the prisoners of war, but the convicts, people used to just think they were sort of schools of vice, is what they used to call the convict hulks. So they used to think that they would be morally corrupting to normal members of society. So people felt that the convicts were more like dangerous. And like we see with Magwitch at the beginning in Great Expectations, he's really frightened. Pip is really frightened of Magwitch because he's seen as this sort of, I think it's like a fearful man.
"Hold your noise," cried a terrible voice as a man started up from among the graves. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse grey, with a great iron on his leg. A man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied around his head. A man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lamed by stones, cut by flints, stung by nettles and torn by briars, who limped, shivered, glared and growled.
And Magwitch is, of course, starving, which I think, reading your articles, that really sort of struck me. Of course, these convicts are horribly underfed, aren't they?
Yeah, so when you think about what they had to do on the hulk, so you're sort of boarded up by night in these ships. You're rowed out in the morning to the dockyards where you labour. Imagine doing a full day's worth of labour on, say, a pint of barley, and water for breakfast, or I think convicts used to have between them, they used to eat in sort of, they called them messes of six. So much like a naval ship, actually, they use these sort of naval terms to describe, the daily routine. So you'd eat in a mess of six. You'd stow your hammock in the morning, but it's not really a healthy diet that they were eating to sustain them in these hard days worth of labour.
So when they were labouring then, were they labouring on the ship or were they taken ashore?
In the daytime, convicts would, they worked around 8 hours labour in the winter or 9 in the summer months when the light was, more up. But they were up about 6 in the morning, and you'd wash, you'd eat breakfast, you sort of clean the decks, and then you got rowed out to shore. So you'd have this big sort of procession of rowboats as, convicts were rowed to shore. And what they did on shore was they hauled timber, they wheeled barrows, shifted sand, they built the breakwaters, essentially. So one thing that people don't really realise is that a lot of the Royal Naval dockyards across Britain and its colonies were built by convict labourers. So they're this free labour source, really, that the government used to help prepare the nation and these key sites for warfare. Convicts were building those places.
Yeah. And the conditions then were just completely dreadful, even by those standards of those times. I mean, what was it like if you were suddenly a convict on one of these ships? What was it like physically in your environment?
Yeah, it wasn't nice. You were selected to go to the hulks if you were strong a lot of the time because they needed people to labour. and do it effectively. But in the dockyards themselves, the dangers, people were always rupturing themselves, hauling these, timbers and things. And, people had amputated limbs, they were sometimes crushed to death. People would drown, sometimes even trying to escape or just, working. I have some convicts in Bermuda, actually, because they expanded the convict station to the overseas colonies in around the 1820s. Convicts there refusing to go down in the diving bell to do underwater work. So really horrendous daily working experiences. But when you compare that to a prison on land, early 19th century prisons on land aren't very nice either. Lots of the whole sort of penal system of the Victorian era is pretty horrible. So, the hulks are bad, but they're in the context of other bad prisons. Yes.
I mean, I'm guessing that around that time, it's not really about rehabilitation at all, is it? Is it just pure punishment? Is that the sort of idea that they have to be made an example of? It's a pure deterrent.
Yeah, certainly in the early 19th century, there is the sense of we need to punish these people. They are bad, they are morally corrupting to the rest of society. But then you get this sort of shift across the 19th century where prison reformers are saying things like, you realize that if you educated these people, they would be able to return to society and be better citizens. So within the hulks, you see that sort of happening. So they imagine the decks of a ship, say HMS Victory is a great example of, what the hulks might have looked like. They're very similar ships, but they're these sort of creaking beams and low ceilings and things like that. So compare that to a prison. What they tried to do in the 19th century was they tried to separate prisoners by cells. So what the prison hulks were always criticised in the press because people used to be able to walk around at night and sort of talk freely. So people, saw the hulks as these, floating academies, floating hells. That's what all these, people, you always come up in Parliament, people saying, we must stop these things. And that's because people could walk around at night, talk to each other, make friends, and as Parliament thought, form gangs where you could then leave the prison hulk or escape together and basically go on a rampage across society. So they tried separating them by cells. They also tried schooling them. So they, in the sort of 1820s onwards, they actually got chaplains in a sort of religious instruction to try and teach convicts. So you would actually come out of the hulks by a lot of the time people left the hulks with better education than when they went in. You could read, you could write, and you even earned a little bit of money, just a nominal sum for doing that labour in the dockyards. So people did actually begin to criticise the hulks because they said people are actually committing crimes to go on them because you have more opportunities when you come out. So, they were almost seen as a sense of a new life.
Berkshire Chronicle, 31st of May, 1856. On their arrival, the convicts are immediately stripped and washed, clothed in coarse grey jackets and breeches, and 2 irons placed on one of their legs, to which degradation everyone must submit, whatever may have been his previous rank and station in the world. They are sent out in gangs of a certain number to work on shore, guarded by soldiers. Out of each shilling earned for the government, the convict is entitled to a penny, but of this he receives only 1/3 weekly, the remainder being left in hand to accumulate until the end of the term which he is doomed to serve. Thus, it sometimes happens that a man who has been 6 or 7 years at the hulks, on his discharge, is put in possession of £10 or £15, beyond which he is supplied with an additional sum of money to defray his travelling expenses home, be it ever so remote. The diet daily is 1/4 pounds of bread, a quart of thick gruel morning and evening, on 4 days of the week, a piece of meat weighing 14 ounces before it is cooked, and on the other 3 days, a 1/4 pound of cheese. Also, an allowance of small beer, and on certain occasions, when work particularly fatiguing and laborious is required, a portion of strong beer is served out.
So actually, they did earn money for their labour then?
Yeah, just a small amount.
That ties in then with Great Expectations. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
And of course, Magwitch is denied the chance to fully realise his identity outside of being a convict by what happens in the story. But by 1860, have the attitudes changed in terms of what people think and feel compared to the 1800s?
Yeah, you definitely see a shift. There's this really interesting shift across the 19th century when you look at, say, newspaper accounts, and some of these were sort of written by, Dickens and his team of writers, But you see things where in the early 19th century, so, around the turn of the century, 1812, things like that, there's lots of newspaper articles saying these people, these convicts, they're a stain on our society and things like that, and that they're morally corrupting. But then by the end of the 19th century. So the hulks in England ended in 1857. That's when they stopped. But we actually get in 1848, the Daily News, which was founded by Dickens, it reports that the hulks had no redeeming feature.
The system should be given up as soon as possible. A barrack should be built on shore, and separate sleeping cells should be provided for the convicts. No good can be permanently done without this. All efforts to convey secular or religious knowledge must be vain, so long as 10 or 20 degraded men are left to sleep in the same compartment and corrupt each other by contact and conversation.
And they said, I don't see why a system that stagnates, debases and corrupts could have gone on for so long. And they're beginning to think that actually it's the prisons themselves and the system that is the thing that is corrupting these people on board. So it's rather, there's this shift where you see actually the convict becomes an object of sympathy, and people are sorry for people who get caught up in this system and they want to help them.
The hulks cannot be kept in a state fit for the habitation of human beings. Filth and fever and personal uncleanliness seem to be inseparable from them. We write this advisedly and with all the facts before us. To guard against any suspicion that we exaggerate the evil, we will quote the sober and reserved language of the government's own report of last year. In the hospital ship the Unity, the great majority of patients were infested with vermin, and their persons, particularly their feet, begrimed with dirt. No regular supply of body linen had been issued, so much so that many men had been 5 weeks without a change, and all record had been lost of the time when the blankets had been washed. Neither towels nor combs were provided for the prisoners' use, and the unwholesome odour from the imperfect and neglected state of the water closets was almost insupportable.
So that's why, we see, I feel, in Great Expectations, we see this sort of redeeming feature of Magwitch. We see that he's actually been caught up in this system, and he went off and he sort of came back rich, but at the end of the day he has been sort of slighted by the prison system, and it's been unjustly so.
There was the man, hugging himself and limping to and fro, waiting for me. He was awfully cold, to be sure. I half expected to see him drop down before my face and die. His eyes looked so awfully hungry, too, that when I handed him the file and he laid it down on the grass, it occurred to me that he would have tried to eat it if he had not seen my bundle. "What's in the bottle, boy?" said he. "Brandy," said I. He was already handing mincemeat down his throat in the most curious manner, more like a man who was putting it away somewhere in a violent hurry than a man who was eating it. But he left off to take some of the liquor. He shivered all the while so violently that it was quite as much as he could do to keep the neck of the bottle between his teeth without biting it off. "I think you've got the ague," said I. "I'm much of your opinion, boy," said he. "It's bad about here," I told him. "You've been lying out on the meshes, and they're dreadful ague-ish, rheumatic too." "I'll eat my breakfast before they're the death of me," said he. He was gobbling mincemeat, meat bone, bread, cheese, and pork pie all at once, staring distrustfully while he did so at the mist all around us, and often stopping, even stopping his jaws to listen. Some real or fancied sound, some clink upon the river or breathing of beast upon the marsh, now gave him a start, and he said suddenly, "You're not a deceiving imp. You brought no one with you." "No, sir, no." "Well," said he, "I believe you. You'd be but a fierce young hound indeed if at your time of life you could help to hunt a wretched warmint, hunted as near death and dunghill as this poor wretched warmint is." Something clicked in his throat, as if he had works in him like a clock and was going to strike, and he smeared his ragged rough sleeve across his eyes. Pitying his desolation and watching him as he gradually settled down upon the pie, I made bold to say, "I'm glad you're enjoying it." "Did you speak?" I said I was glad you're enjoying it. Thank you, my boy. I do.
In your research, have you come across stories that have really humanized it? Have there been things that have sort of affected you reading it?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about, the prison system today, it's really sort of, it has changed. The way that we have these, our attitudes have changed and things like that. But thinking about separation from family for me is a big one. So I think about the system of transportation as a whole. You commit a crime, the crimes that people were committing that landed them on the hulks. They were small fry in today's society. Stealing a loaf of bread, stealing some clothes, things like that, and then you get separated from your family potentially for your whole life for something like that. So you can be imprisoned for 7 years, 14, or life. And you see small children, under some of them under the age of 10 were actually being transported, and you just think, a child in that system with very little sort of care, you just think, what must that have felt like? Even for older prisoners, I just think, how terrible that must have felt, being separated from your family and not knowing what was going to happen to you. I always say that there's like sort of, there's a few ways that you could get off the hulks, and that's escape, pardon, transportation, or death. So you're apart from pardon, potentially escape, you're not really looking at a great options there.
Yeah, and you mentioned children as well. So Pip's anxiety that in helping Magwitch, the law's going to come down against him isn't necessarily quite as far-fetched as a reader might think, because actually the idea that children under 10 can be transported. I mean, what would they have done at the age of 10 to have got them into that situation?
I mean, we kind of see it in Oliver Twist. It's things like stealing handkerchiefs, or working in gangs that pickpockets and things like that. So these some boys were under 10. Some were up to sort of 15 is how they sort of classified a child, in the Victorian era. So they weren't. So the hulks start in 1776. It's just a temporary measure, that goes on for over 80 years in this country, in England. But the children weren't segregated until the 1820s. So it's a huge actual, sort of stretch of time where children were not being sort of accounted for as children. That there were chaplains that said, we must remember that at present they are children, so should be treated differently. So it becomes, children were sort of, obviously a prey of sort of predatory, people on board the hulks. They didn't labour in the dockyards. What children did on board the hulks was they actually stayed on board, and they did smaller things like they learned crafts like shoemaking or tailoring, and they were learning those crafts so that when they got transported to Australia, they would be easily sort of picked up and put in a job like that. So they were sort of doing different things. But at night, imagine, those doors locking down, not segregated by cells. It's a very dangerous environment for children.
And when you talk about transportation, of course, it's so interesting, because I immediately, if I think of, British imperial history and that happening, you always assume it's Australia. At least I did. But of course, it's the American colonies to begin with.
Yeah. This was something that I read Moll Flanders a long time ago, and I was like, oh yeah, she was transported to this colonies in Virginia. And so, in the early period of transportation, before the War of American Independence in 1775, Britain used to transport men and women and children to, the colonies in, say, Virginia and, the east coast of us, the Americas. So, that was a long established tradition. And so when, the sort of doors to America essentially close with American independence, there's this huge sort of scrabbling around by the British government where they're trying to work out, what should we do with all our convicts? They don't realize at that point that maybe they should put some effort into reforming them and, having prisons be a slightly better system. So they're like, where should we send them? And so that's why you have this sort of, like I said, they're scrabbling around. But, in the early period, they're trying to send them to Africa. They're coming up with all these different places until they finally settle on Botany Bay in the Australian colonies, which are essentially sort of new.
Yes. I mean, I heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that actually there were more casualties from soldiers from the Continental Army put on these prison ships than actually died in battle.
Yeah, I mean, prisoners of war are interesting because they're held on board these prison ships as well. They're not in the same spaces as convicts. Like I said, they're sort of neighbouring. So you'd have all these ships in the dockyard. So you actually have naval ships. You'd have, troop ships, even coal hulks. And these dockyards are very mixed spaces. So yeah, you'd have a prisoner of war ship. So there's this one called the Jersey in New York around the sort of American Revolution era, and that always gets a lot of big press. Of American, patriots being held in there, and terrible numbers of people dying. And there's even a monument to them in one of the parks in New York. But one of the things about prisoners of war is that you see this huge surge of prisoner memoirs of people, recounting their experiences on the terrible ships. So the Jersey is often in poems, and even French prisoners of war. There's one called Louis Garneret. He wrote something published in the 1840s, which was his memoirs of being a prisoner of war on the hulks at Portsmouth. And they always sort of tie in with the sort of nationalist fervour. So it's difficult to tell, the truth from the lies in a sense, because sometimes, it's sort of in the national interest to say, weren't the British terrible to our nation? And so, it's complicated.
Yeah. Is there a connection between the convict ships, the prisoner of war ships, and the slave ships that are around in those earlier years?
I think that's a very interesting point and comparison to make. I think what used to happen when actually they were trying to abolish transportation, so this is convicts, they would liken the hulks to slave ships, and they would say, these convicts are treated like slaves. And there's this sort of weird discourse happening where, now we see slavery as, terrible, but at the time, people were almost saying, pity the poor convict, they are treated like a slave. And it's like, very interesting discourse. But I think the comparisons between the three types of convict, prisoner of war, and slave ships, they're really interesting, because in the 19th century, the 18th century, all these centuries of history, it's happening all the time. So you have French, even in the French Empire, there's hulks. They're called the bagnes. And we see them at the end of, actually at the beginning of Les Miserables, even if you've just seen the movie with Hugh Jackman. It starts with them, retrieving the flag from their convict ship. And it's like, it's happening across empires, all of this, slavery and, imprisonment and types of imprisonment. It's not just Britain that's doing this.
And what caused them to end in the end? I mean, how did it all finish? When were they got rid of?
Well, in England, they ended in 1857. It was after a sort of period of gradual decline. So across the period of the hulks in England, there's this sort of different periods of management. So, you have the early period is managed by a private contractor called Duncan Campbell, and he actually had links with slavery. He owned a plantation in Jamaica, and he actually, as his prison ships that he supplied the government, he actually lobbied to the government and said, I can hold them, and he used his former merchant ships, which may have carried slaves to the colonies. But then you get a sort of period where they're managed by the Home Office. So, the government becomes more directly in control of the convicts. They try to align them with the other prisons going on, in that period. So Millbank or Pentonville, these sort of big 19th century prisons we think of now. And then they were taken over by the Prison Inspectorate, and they're a new body formed in the sort of mid 19th century who really argue that the hulks were rubbish. So they were just like, there is no way you can possibly reform someone. So they gradually start to phase them out. And by 1857, there's only one hulk left in Woolwich called the Defence, and it catches fire. And there's a great, in the London Illustrated News, there's a great picture of the convicts at work breaking up the hulk. And it's like the sort of night scene. And they look like little devils with pickaxes, sort of hacking away at the bare bones of this, the timbers of this ship.
Morning Chronicle, 15th of July, 1857. At 9 o'clock yesterday morning, a dense volume of smoke issuing from the hold of the Defence convict ship, lying off Woolwich Arsenal, indicated that the vessel was on fire. The convicts, being 200 and 300 in number, were immediately mustered and removed without accident from the burning hulk. Telegraphic messages summoned the London Fire Brigade to the spot, and at 1 o'clock it was determined to scuttle the ship as the only means of extinguishing the fire. This was soon accomplished, and with a heavy lurch, which swamped a barge on which one of the fire engines was placed, the huge ship settled down in the water. The Defence was formerly one of Nelson's 74s, and did some work in the memorable action off Cape Trafalgar, which terminated the great seaman's career. It is supposed that the fire originated in the spontaneous combustion of some coals, of which she received a fresh supply on Monday. She is probably too far damaged for further service, and it is anticipated that orders will be received at the dockyard to break her up in a few days.
Is that really how it ends? That it ends with the last one on fire and they're sort of hammering?
Yeah, exactly.
Break.
And what convicts were doing, the whole time while they were in these hulks was they were building barracks on land. They might have been repairing the dockyards, but they were also building administrative buildings. So they actually, in many cases, built their own prisons. So they would go off the hulks once they'd broken them down and then go into these ones on land. But in Bermuda, convicts were on hulks until, say, 1863, and they were even in Gibraltar until 1875. So you have this sort of slow decline, even slower in the colonies, because it's so much slower to get that administration working. And there's even still a sense by the government that it's useful to still have these convicts working. So it takes a lot longer in colonies to get rid of them.
And then, of course, there are prison ships in more recent years as well, aren't there, around the world? And so it's not just a 19th century British invention, as you say, other nations did it. And what do you think the legacy then is of all of them? Because I have to say, I think I've been inside a prison before. I was doing a show and we were doing some Shakespeare and we went in and performed it. And this was at a correctional facility in America. And it did strike me what a sad, upsetting life these people led. I didn't like it at all. I really didn't feel like it was necessary. I mean, of course, they may have done the most appalling things. I didn't know what they were in there for. It is an interesting idea. I mean, that the debate, I think, that starts in the 19th century really is still with us today, isn't it?
Yeah, there's still this sense of like, what do you do with someone who, say, transgressed against the law? What if you've committed a crime? What do we do with those people? In the 19th century, we're saying, do we treat them with compassion or do we punish them? Do we send them away, banish them to the colonies, or do we, sort of try to help reintegrate them into society? But yeah, I think my sort of opinion on the hulks is they didn't work because they they were horrible places that people were separated from their families, and that the hulks themselves were these sort of crumbling ships. So people would have a lot of respiratory problems because the air quality was so bad in them. You even get the hulks in Woolwich are being criticised in the 1850s because they say they're the locus of cholera in this area. Down with the hulks. And it's because people think that they're giving off this miasma, the 19th century idea that, we're breathing in polluted air and it's making us, get cholera. But in fact, it was just because actually the toilets were just running into the water and everyone was drinking the water. So, it's...
That's not good.
No, exactly. But you think about them around the world, people are still saying today, let's use ships to detain people. So in New York, in areas of America, they're still using actual ships. Cruise ships sometimes are configured into these new floating prisons. But I remember when there was this Tory race for power recently in the press, they were saying Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss are saying, let's put refugees on cruise ships. And it's like, you're suggesting that you detain people on a ship. In history, that has not worked, and it's basically pretty punishing. You are isolated from land. You're on a floating island. How is that any different from, say, Alcatraz or somewhere like that?
No, it isn't.
One of the things I find interesting is Magwitch getting rich, and I just think that, that sense of like the hulks could be like a better life kind of thing. So in 1851, there's these gold rushes in Australia, and people begin to want to get on the hulks. People, in the newspapers, it's always reported that they're, trying to get on the hulks. Even, during the Irish famine, for example, Irish nationalist John Mitchell, he actually said that Irish people were going to be hulking as a profession. And he said that because he felt that, the hulks were actually offering people food, a place to live and a place to work. And then, in the 1850s, you see in England, there's this sort of reporting in the press where people think people are trying to get on the hulks because they want to get rich. They want to be transported. And you see that with Magwitch, he comes back rich. And I think he makes his money out of wool or sheep or something like that. But, for many people, going to Australia in the 1850s, there's this gold rush. Everyone's heading to Melbourne or, places like that. And other hulks, are they actually the stepping stone to that in a way?
That's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, it's high-risk strategy, isn't it? Because, of course, you can't commit a crime so bad that you end up being strapped there for life. You have to be...
Exactly.
You have to be able to be pardoned.
Yeah, exactly. And in the early 19th century, people did sometimes get transported and actually make their way back home. So people used to say, hulks are terrible because they're this place where people can go and talk to each other, and people who've made it rich and then actually recommitted, a crime and gone back on the hulks have said, oh yeah, it's great in the Australian colonies. Let's all go over there together and make some money. And the government is, meanwhile, sort of having a not enjoying this kind of conversation. So that's why they try and, build those cells, because it's really that sense of talking to each other can actually, corrupt the whole ship.
I'm going to mention something because you're not going to mention it because I think you're too modest, but you won the Alexander Prize.
I did.
For an essay, Allowed to Die. Is that to do with what happened to the convict corpses? Is that right?
Yeah. So in the early period on board the hulk, so, we're talking like end of the 18th century, 1 in 4 convicts actually died on board the hulks. Now, they said that was because the rations were so bad and the living conditions were so bad. So lots of convicts were, they were actually reporting they didn't have any shoes, they didn't have any clothes. Lots of people actually had their family members bring them clothes because they were freezing and they were, dying in these great numbers. So this article that I wrote sort of explores the use and abuse of convict corpses. In 1847, there's this huge scandal that erupts in Parliament as one MP stands up in the House of Commons and he says, I've got a letter from a convict here, and it says that they're illegally dissecting convict corpses. So they're saying that they're not waiting the requisite legal amount of time before they start dissecting convicts. And the convicts on board believe, they say, that they're being allowed to die for the sake of the schools of anatomy. And it's this public scandal where someone from the prison inspectorate has to go on board, do a huge inquiry to see what is actually going on these hulks. And it turns out that there's these huge medical abuses where the chief of staff of the medical division of the hulks, he's called Peter Bossy, and there's all these accusations of cruelty where he makes his rounds of the hospital ward. So they used to have a hospital ward on board each of the hulks for convicts who got sick or hurt in the dockyards. And, they said that this guy Bossy was going round and he was sort of tapping prisoners on the head with his stick and saying, what's wrong with you, my boy? And things like that. And that actually when convicts were dying, they were selling them off cheaply for the anatomy schools. So the article explores the way that the bodies of the poor, so with the poor law, paupers, people are comparing them to convicts and saying that actually bodies of the poor are being mistreated in the same way as criminals. And it's that idea that, we see this in Dickens all the time with the social reform, and especially in, I think, is it the beginning of Oliver Twist is talking about the poor law. It's all driven by that and the idea that actually workhouses are there to punish people for being poor. And they're using bodies of paupers for anatomy instead sometimes of bodies of convicts. And that's because people are saying, we don't want to dissect a convict. They're dirty. They could spread disease. And so they're saying, give us the poor people instead. And it's like this idea of punishing people, because in the 19th century, people didn't like being dissected because it meant that parts of your body would, you wouldn't go up to heaven if, parts of you had been, taken out. So, it's sort of exploring that and seeing, how the pauper and the convict are being compared in society and what's happening to both of them.
My convict never looked at me except that once. While we stood in the hut, he stood before the fire looking thoughtfully at it, or putting up his feet by turns upon the hob, and looking thoughtfully at them, as if he pitied them for their recent adventures. Suddenly, he turned to the sergeant and remarked, "I wish to say something respecting this escape. It may prevent some persons laying under suspicion no longer me. I took some victuals up at the village over yonder, from the blacksmith's. It was some broken victuals and a dram of liquor in a pie." "Have you happened to miss such an article as a pie, blacksmith?" asked the sergeant confidently. "My wife did at the very moment you came in. Don't you know, Pip?" "So," said my convict, turning his eyes on Joe in a moody manner, and without the least glance at me. "So, you're the blacksmith, are you? And I'm sorry to say I've eat your pie." "God knows you're welcome to it, so far as it were ever mine," returned Joe. "We don't know what you've done, but we wouldn't have you starved to death for it. Poor miserable fellow. Would us, Pip?" The something that I'd noticed before clicked in the man's throat again, and he turned his back. The boat had returned and his guard were ready, so we followed him to the landing place and saw him put into the boat, which was rowed by a crew of convicts like himself. We saw the black hulk lying out a little way from the mud of the shore, like a wicked Noah's Ark, cribbed and barred and moored by massive rusty chains. The prison ship seemed in my young eyes to be ironed, like the prisoners. We saw the boat go alongside, and we saw him taking up the side and disappear. Then the ends of the torches were flung, hissing, into the water and went out, as if it were all over with him.
I love that quote from Mrs. Joe when she's saying, the people are put on the hulks because they murder and they rob and forge and do all sorts of bad. I just love that. As a child, you're experiencing this and he's just so afraid. And I also love that, we know that Dickens was, living around Chatham and Gad's Hill Place. So, he would have seen the hulks when he was a kid.
Yes.
He would have heard those noises. People always say, don't they, with the Great Expectations, one of the more autobiographical versions of his stories, but I definitely think that his connection to Portsmouth, his dad, who being born there, that's where the hulks were too. So Dickens is always connected to the hulks, and this is the only story where he begins to sort of explore that and unpack it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And do you think what he says about them is authentic? Does it ring true? He doesn't go to massive detail anyway. I mean, there's never a scene on one of the hulks, is there?
Yeah, it's so frustrating. I always wish that, he would go on board and we get to see, through Dickens's eyes. But, we do have the social reformer Henry Mayhew goes on board and he says they're terrible. So, I'm always sort of satisfied with that. But yeah, I think, when you think about Great Expectations, what's interesting about it is that it's actually a historical novel, so it starts more like that Napoleonic era. So it's the early years of the hulks that he's characterizing at the beginning, because we see Pip throughout his life. So him as a child is him in 1810s, 1820s. When you think about that, I mentioned that shift in perceptions over time. Dickens is using that early perception of the hulks as something to be afraid of and morally corrupting. He's tapping into those memories. And then we're seeing almost throughout the novel that sense of change over time, where at the end we're sorry for Magwitch. He's been abused by the system. Yeah, I always think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and very powerful. Anna, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. And good luck. And I look forward to your book.
Yes, it's in the works.
Do you have a title yet for it?
Oh, well, Wicked Noah's Arks would be a great one, given that that's what Dickens said.
Yep, very good. We'll go with that for now then.
Either that or Incredible Hulks, but
Well, actually, that's also very good. Yeah. Yeah, I'm torn. I'm torn on that.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
See you later.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much, and see you next time.